All right, in this video, I'm going to overview the instructions that you find at the top of each lab. These instructions are similar enough from lab to lab that I'm not going to shoot a separate overview video for each set of instructions. I'm just going to explain this once here in lab 1, but do read them each time because there are some parts that change, and these parts are pretty significant. Okay, let's scroll on down and see what we have. Now I should say that these instructions are editable by the instructor, and so they may vary a little bit from institution to institution, but they should be pretty similar to what we're looking at now. So the first thing you're going to find are these links, and these are links to the overview videos. You are currently watching the second one on the instructions at the top of each lab, and I'm currently shooting it. And after this, you see there are overview videos on the background sections of the lab and on the procedure sections of the lab. Now up here it says to read the background sections before beginning the lab. And that's important. There's all sorts of useful and important information in the background sections that you will need once you get down into the procedure sections. So definitely read the background sections first. Don't just jump to the procedure sections. You'll need that information. And also sometimes there are points to be had in the background sections. Not in this lab, but in some of the others. So don't just fly past them. Then you will have some specific instructions, and these instructions will change from lab to lab. This is the part that you really need to read each time. Most of the time, these will be instructions to put in your observations for the next lab. We put the observations in a week early, so the images come back in time to do the lab. Now, the next lab is lab 2, and lab 2 is one of our traditional labs in which we won't be using the Skynet telescopes, so you don't need to put in observations for lab 2. You will be putting in observations for the second week of lab 1, and that will be explained below. Now, instead of having that kind of message, here we have a different message specific to lab 1. And that is in lab 1, you're going to be observing or trying to observe a whole bunch of objects, all the planets, their moons, most of the dwarf planets. And these objects are spread all across the sky, and you'll be doing this lab at some specific time. And at any specific time, some of these objects will be too close to the sun to observe. So you can't observe everything. And you'll learn as you're going through the procedure how to determine whether an object is currently observable or not. If it's not, it probably won't be for weeks or maybe even months. So observe what is observable for when you're doing the lab, and if it's not observable, don't worry about it. Now, this means you can't get all of the points in the lab. This lab is worth 130 some points, and most of those points are driven by your observations. And sometimes half of the objects won't be observable, which means approximately half of the points won't be gettable. And once the lab is done and you check your score, maybe you only got 70 or 80 or 90 points out of 130 some. And that's a pretty low percentage. What I'm telling you now is don't let that freak you out. Focus on the score and not on the percentage. The lab really isn't out of 130 some points because not all the objects are observable. Your instructor will take your scores, not your percentages, but your scores, and find a good way to convert them into a letter grade. Okay. Now the remaining instructions are in bold, and these are exactly the same from lab to lab, and they're important. If you don't heed these instructions, you can lose a lot of points. Now the first point here is that you can submit your questions up to 100 times. In fact, WebAssign allows you to submit and save. You can save as many times as you want, but you have to remember to submit at least once by the end of the lab. You know, once you're done, be sure to submit at least once. If you don't submit, if you only saved, then your instructor won't receive your responses and you'll get a 0. So what I've done is I've set it up that you can submit each part of the lab, each question, up to 100 times. That means you could change your mind 100 times. So my recommendation is to not even mess with the save button. Just use the submit button. Now, if you find yourself in this position where you saved but forgot to submit, go talk to your instructor. There's a button they can press that will submit your answers after the fact. But you don't want to make a habit of that. It might frustrate your instructor. So again, I recommend that you just use the submit button, and then everything should be okay. Now, the second point here is to submit your work frequently. After you answer each question, go ahead and submit it. If you work on the lab and then walk away, maybe for a few hours and come back, WebAssign will time you out. And often you don't even realize that you've been timed out. You could complete the rest of the lab, submit it, and nothing goes through because you've been timed out. So as you complete the various parts, submit them. And if you're gone for a long period of time, you may want to refresh your browser and make sure you're still logged in. Now, the third point here is to not have multiple copies of WebAssign open on your computer, whether in different tabs or different browsers. That can confuse WebAssign, and your answers may not get submitted. So you don't want that either. Just have one copy of WebAssign open at a time. Now, the remaining points are about individual responses. Some of the responses will be short answers, where you're typing in words and letters, but some of them will be numerical, where you're typing in numbers. Now, if it's a numerical response, unless otherwise specified, you want to use 3 significant digits. Not 3 decimal places, but 3 significant digits. You can have more if you want, but make sure you have at least 3. For example, take the number 2.57. That's 3 significant digits. Even though it only had 2 decimal places, the 0.57, you had 3 digits of significance. And that's what WebAssign is looking for. A lot of the numerical responses will be automatically graded by WebAssign. And if you don't have 3 significant digits, you can sometimes get it marked wrong. Okay. The next point is sometimes you're going to have to enter very large numbers or very small numbers. And this is astronomy. We deal in very big numbers and sometimes very small numbers. And the best way to represent those is with scientific notation. And when doing that, you have to enter it a particular way or else WebAssign won't accept it. So here's the proper format. If you have some number times 10 to the minus 3, you enter that number and then e negative sign 3, like you would on a calculator. Don't type in the number and then times 10 to the minus 3. Don't type it in like we say it. WebAssign won't know how to interpret it, and it will submit a blank response for you, as if you didn't even answer the question. Be sure to use the right format when using scientific notation. The next point is not to add units. If it's a numerical response, the units are usually written there outside of the entry box. Don't re-enter them inside the box. If you enter any letters with your numbers, WebAssign will get confused. So if it's a numerical response, just enter the number. And lastly, you'll be uploading some files. In this lab, there'll be images that you've taken. And in other labs, there'll be images and also graphs that you've made. Make sure that the file names just use regular characters, letters and numbers. Don't use any special characters. If you do that, WebAssign can again get confused and lose your image. Okay, that's it for this video.